She's my teacher, but when she told me to stay after class, I had no idea what lessons I was about to learn. The first time I truly noticed her, it wasn't during a dramatic confrontation or a moment of high tension, it was in the quiet rhythm of the classroom, where sunlight spilled lazily through the tall windows and dust motes danced like tiny golden sparks in the afternoon air. She moved with a calm authority, each gesture deliberate yet effortless. There was a grace to the way she shifted her weight, the subtle tilt of her head as she scanned the students' work, and the way her fingers brushed against the edge of her desk, as if she were coaxing knowledge out of the very room itself. I was a 24-year-old student, someone who usually blended into the background, quietly observing. And yet, something about her presence made the air feel warmer, heavier, charged with quiet energy I didn't quite understand. She was in her early 40s, and there was an elegance to her age, a sense of lived experience that added depth to her every word. Her voice, steady and clear, carried the kind of confidence that made you pay attention without needing to demand it. But beneath that calm professionalism, there was a warmth, a subtle softness in her smile when she caught a student struggling to grasp a concept. I noticed small details that didn't matter to anyone else, the faint scent of her perfume, light and floral, that seemed to linger around her, the way her hair caught the light as she tucked a loose strand behind her ear, and the gentle curve of her wrist as she gestured toward the whiteboard. My chest tightened in a way I couldn't rationalize. It was just a teacher, and yet, it felt like the world had tilted slightly, just enough for me to notice. The lecture ended in the usual shuffle of students gathering their belongings, chairs scraping softly across the floor. I tried to focus on packing my own bag, but my eyes kept drifting to her, noticing how she lingered a fraction longer than necessary by the desk, reviewing her notes, her posture relaxed yet commanding. There was a quiet invitation in her composure, though I didn't know what it meant, or if it meant anything at all. Even as I left the room that day, her presence lingered in my mind like a soft echo, making the routine campus corridors feel strangely charged. I realized, somewhere deep inside, that this was more than casual admiration. It was curiosity, an inexplicable pull toward understanding her, toward being noticed by her. And when she quietly said, "Stay after class tomorrow. I'll show you a few real lessons," it didn't sound like a standard teacher's request. Somehow, I knew that staying behind would change something in the rhythm of my days, and I wasn't sure if I was ready, or if I even wanted to be. The next day, I found myself lingering near the classroom door long after the lecture had ended. Most students had already spilled into the bustling hallways, their chatter and footsteps fading into the distant hum of campus life. The room was quieter now, sunlight slanting through the windows at a softer angle, painting golden rectangles across the floor. My heart thumped a little faster than usual, the anticipation and nervousness knotting together in a way I hadn't expected. She remained at the front of the room, straightening her notes and moving slowly, deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world. Her presence seemed to stretch and expand, filling the room in a way that made it impossible to focus on anything else. When she finally looked up, her eyes met mine, steady, warm, and just faintly amused. There was no reprimand for my lingering, instead, her gaze seemed to welcome me, drawing me forward without words. "Stay after class for a moment," she said, her voice calm, soft, and just a touch lighter than usual, almost intimate. The words themselves seemed ordinary, but the way she spoke them carried a weight I couldn't ignore. My throat went dry. I nodded, fumbling to hide the quickening of my pulse as I gathered my books. As the last students left, the classroom transformed. The noise faded entirely, replaced by the soft scrape of her chair against the floor and the faint rustle of papers. The sunlight filtering through the windows highlighted her profile, sharp yet gentle lines, the subtle curve of her neck, the delicate sweep of her hair falling over her shoulder. My gaze lingered, aware of how much I was noticing, and yet unable to look away. When she gestured toward the desk for me to come closer, her hand hovered a moment longer than strictly necessary, her fingers brushing the edges of her notebook as she moved. My own hand brushed against the corner of the desk as I stepped forward, and for an instant, the warmth of proximity hit me, like standing too close to sunlight, both startling and comforting. As we sat, reviewing my notes, there was a subtle shift in the air between us. Her posture relaxed, leaning slightly closer to point at my work, the faint scent of her perfume enveloping me, and her shoulder brushing mine just barely. I could feel a quiet energy passing in these small, unintentional touches. It wasn't overt, it wasn't inappropriate, yet it was undeniably intimate. In that moment, I realized staying after class wasn't about the lesson itself. It was about being here, about noticing her, and letting myself be noticed. And though I tried to keep my mind on the papers in front of me, a part of me silently thrilled at the thought that this was only the beginning of something unspoken, something quietly, impossibly magnetic. Sitting across from her at the desk, I felt a strange combination of nervousness and fascination. The classroom, empty now except for the two of us, felt warmer somehow, sunlight pooling on the floorboards and the faint hum of the air conditioning creating a quiet cocoon around us. The usual lines between teacher and student seemed to blur, replaced by a softer, more intimate rhythm. She leaned forward to examine my notebook, her shoulder brushing mine ever so slightly. The touch was fleeting, accidental, or perhaps it wasn't, but it sent an unexpected warmth through me. I became acutely aware of her presence, the gentle cadence of her voice, the faint scent of her perfume that lingered like a memory, the soft way her hair fell across her shoulder whenever she shifted. Every small detail seemed magnified, each glance and gesture charged with a subtle tension I couldn't name. "This part here," she said, pointing at a passage in my notes, "isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding the context, how one thing connects to another." Her hand hovered over mine for a moment as she traced a line with her pen, close enough that I felt the heat radiating from her skin. I tried to focus on the words, but the proximity of her presence made concentration difficult. As she explained, she occasionally shared small personal anecdotes, stories of past students, brief reflections on her own experiences, or tiny glimpses of life outside the classroom. There was a vulnerability in the way she spoke, a quiet honesty that made her seem even more human, less like the untouchable figure of authority I had assumed. I listened, captivated not just by the lesson, but by her, the way her eyes softened when she recounted something meaningful, the subtle smile tugging at the corners of her lips, and the occasional thoughtful pause that made me lean in closer, even if only in my mind. Our hands brushed again when I reached for a pen, and though it was brief, the contact lingered in my senses, a small spark of connection neither of us addressed out loud. I felt a mix of exhilaration and hesitation, the pull of something unspoken threading between us. Every glance held the weight of curiosity and admiration, every shared smile an unvoiced acknowledgement of the bond slowly forming. By the end of the session, I realized the lesson wasn't just about academics. It was about presence, awareness, and connection. The way she shared herself, her attention, her warmth, her quiet steadiness, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before. And as I packed my things, careful not to rush, I knew that whatever this was, it had only just begun, and that each lesson with her would carry a deeper meaning I was only beginning to understand. The study session had officially ended, yet neither of us seemed eager to leave. The afternoon had shifted toward evening, and the classroom was bathed in a soft, golden glow as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the floor. It was quiet now, the usual background noise of the campus replaced by a calm stillness, broken only by the faint shuffle of papers and the distant hum of the corridor beyond the closed door. She gathered her books slowly, her movements deliberate, as if savoring the final moments before the room emptied completely. When she looked up, our eyes met, and for a heartbeat, words seemed unnecessary. There was an almost imperceptible pause, a moment suspended in the warm light, where the space between us felt charged with unspoken intention. My chest tightened, and I realized that this was no longer simply a lesson about notes or assignments, it was about the quiet gravity of being near her, the pull of proximity, the subtle tension in each glance and gesture. As she moved to hand me a stack of papers, her fingers brushed mine briefly. The touch was fleeting, accidental in appearance, yet it sent a ripple of warmth through me, grounding and exhilarating all at once. I could feel her subtle energy, steady, calming, and yet intensely present. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume again, delicate and lingering, a soft floral note that seemed to follow her every movement. She straightened her scarf and, in doing so, leaned just slightly closer, the warmth of her presence brushing against me. I felt the faint pressure of her shoulder against mine as she adjusted the papers, a sensation so minor yet so overwhelmingly intimate. We both paused, as if acknowledging the invisible thread connecting us, but neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was charged, a quiet acknowledgement of mutual curiosity, attraction, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of something more profound developing. Even as I prepared to leave, I found myself hesitating, reluctant to break the spell of this fragile, suspended moment. Her gaze lingered on me longer than necessary, soft and measured, and I sensed her own hesitation, the unspoken question in her eyes: how much was safe to reveal, how much could be allowed in this delicate space between teacher and student. Finally, I stepped back, taking a deep breath as the golden light faded into the evening shadows. My mind was buzzing with anticipation, excitement, and a hint of trepidation. I knew this was only the beginning. The connection we had sparked was quiet but undeniable, a slow-burning ember that promised something deeper, richer, and profoundly human, something that neither of us could ignore, even if we tried. And as I left the classroom, the echo of her presence lingered, warming the cool air around me, leaving me acutely aware that the lessons I was about to learn went far beyond the pages of my notebook. A few days later, the classroom felt different. The routine hum of campus life was replaced by an almost sacred quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She had asked me to come in early this time, ostensibly to review my assignments, but the tension in the air hinted that this session would be unlike the others. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, soft and golden, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the warm afternoon light. We sat across from each other, closer than usual, the stack of papers between us serving as both shield and invitation. She leaned forward slightly to look at my notes, her shoulder brushing mine ever so subtly. Every accidental touch felt charged, as though the simple act of being near each other carried unspoken meaning. I tried to focus on the work, tracing the lines with my pen, but her presence kept tugging my attention elsewhere, the way her eyes softened when she laughed at something trivial, the way her lips curved into a small, almost shy smile, and the quiet steadiness of her voice that made my chest feel tight and light at the same time. After a few minutes, she closed her notebook and leaned back, her gaze turning inward for a moment, thoughtful. Then, almost as if deciding to trust me with something deeper, she began to speak, not about grades or notes, but about life. She shared a small, personal story from her past, moments of vulnerability she rarely revealed, times of doubt, the weight of expectations, the quiet loneliness that sometimes accompanied her confidence. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, occasionally gesturing, delicate and deliberate, each motion imbued with authenticity. I listened, rapt, noticing how her voice carried subtle tremors when she spoke of regrets, how her eyes flickered with memories both tender and painful. There was a profound honesty in her words that pulled me in, and for a moment, the roles of teacher and student seemed irrelevant. She wasn't just an authority figure, she was human, approachable, and deeply real. As she spoke, her hand brushed mine while pointing at a page, lingering slightly longer than necessary. My pulse quickened. I felt the warmth of her skin, the delicate pressure, and the gentle acknowledgement of connection without a single word. The room seemed smaller, warmer, as if every breath we took was shared. When she finally looked up, her eyes met mine with a quiet intensity. In that gaze, I understood, the attraction, the curiosity, the subtle pull between us, was mutual. Neither of us spoke it aloud, but the silence itself became a confession, a shared acknowledgement that the bond forming between us was more than academic, more than incidental. And in that moment, I knew our connection had shifted irrevocably, paving the way for deeper lessons yet to come, lessons of emotion, trust, and unspoken desire. It was evening when I found myself walking back into the classroom, the hallways quiet and the campus almost deserted. The golden glow of the setting sun had faded into a softer twilight, casting long shadows that stretched across the empty desks. The air felt charged in a way I hadn't anticipated, heavy with anticipation and the lingering scent of her perfume that seemed to have followed me into the room. She was already there, seated at her desk, reviewing some papers. The dim light outlined the graceful curve of her shoulders, the delicate sweep of her hair across her neck. When she looked up and caught my gaze, a faint smile tugged at her lips, warm and knowing. It was the kind of smile that acknowledged everything unspoken between us, that conveyed understanding without the need for words. We sat down across from each other, closer than usual, a quiet electricity vibrating in the space between us. I could feel the faint brush of her hand as she passed me a notebook, and my pulse quickened. The subtle warmth of her skin, the gentle pressure of her fingers against mine, the intimacy of the contact, it all felt profoundly significant, though simple in form. Every touch, every glance, carried meaning, and I realized just how much I had been noticing her, cataloging these small, exquisite moments in my mind. She leaned forward to point at a note, and our knees brushed beneath the desk. It was a fleeting contact, accidental perhaps, but neither of us moved away. Instead, the slight brush seemed to solidify something between us, a shared understanding of the bond that had been quietly growing. Her voice was calm, steady, but there was an undercurrent of softness, a gentle warmth that made the world outside the classroom feel distant and irrelevant. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly feel the weight of it. The admiration, the attraction, the respect I had felt from the beginning, it had deepened into something undeniable. And I sensed that she felt it too. Her eyes lingered on mine longer than usual, and I could see a flicker of acknowledgement there, the quiet thrill of recognition, the subtle hesitation that spoke volumes. The room seemed to shrink around us, the outside world fading into a blur of shadows and soft light. Every movement she made, every soft breath, every glance, it all resonated like an unspoken confession. In that moment, I realized we were no longer simply teacher and student. We were two people, aware of each other, drawn together by curiosity, admiration, and something tender yet potent. The emotional spark we had been nurturing for weeks was now undeniable, glowing quietly but brilliantly between us. And though we didn't speak the words aloud, the silence itself was a promise, that whatever came next, it would be shared, cherished, and approached with care. The classroom was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. The day had given way to evening, and the usual bustle of campus life had faded into distant echoes. Everything felt hushed, intimate, as though the world had agreed to step aside and let this moment unfold. She stood by the desk, gathering her papers, her movements calm and deliberate. When our eyes met, there was a subtle acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us, the shared glances, the fleeting touches, the quiet energy that had been building over days and weeks. There was no need for words, the connection was palpable, threaded through each small gesture, each lingering look. I approached slowly, careful not to break the fragile intimacy of the moment. She offered me a faint, knowing smile, and I felt my chest tighten at the sight. It wasn't just admiration or attraction, it was recognition, a quiet understanding that the bond we had nurtured was mutual. As she handed me my notes, our fingers brushed lightly. The contact was brief, but it lingered in my mind, the warmth of her touch leaving a quiet echo. She stepped closer, her shoulder grazing mine, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. I became acutely aware of her presence, the subtle scent of her perfume, the gentle sway of her hair, the calm confidence in her posture. Each detail was magnified, a sensory reminder of how deeply I had come to feel for her. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice almost a whisper, though it carried more meaning than I could put into words. She nodded, her eyes soft and warm, and for a heartbeat, we simply stood there, letting the silence speak for us. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned forward, and our hands touched again, brief, grounding, and full of unspoken promise. It was the kind of contact that conveyed everything words could not: trust, connection, and the quiet thrill of being seen and understood. In that gentle gesture, I felt the culmination of weeks of subtle glances, lingering moments, and emotional tension finally coalesce into something tender, intimate, and real. When I finally stepped back and turned to leave, she watched me with a calm, reassuring gaze. I felt a warmth lingering in the space between us, a silent promise that this was not the end. Our connection had reached a point of quiet completeness, satisfying, human, and full of potential. Walking down the empty hallway, I realized that the lessons she had promised were never about textbooks or lectures. They were about presence, understanding, and the slow unfolding of emotion, the kind that lingers, reshapes you, and leaves you quietly changed. And though the moment had ended, the bond we had forged would stay with me, tender, unspoken, and profoundly alive. If you enjoyed this story and felt every moment of their slow-burning connection, make sure to follow and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.